Okay, our goal in our workshop was to try to define and discuss problems relating to law and justice. And obviously a huge problem that's been talked about for decades. And I doubt we'll ever come to any resolution, but I think we can at least outline some perspectives that may help us understand the place of humiliation and dignity in our ideas of law and justice. And one of the things that's important, especially for what we've been talking about here, is the role of language in law and justice, and the role of language in making humiliation and causing pain okay to do, and providing for human dignity somehow not okay to do. And how we can have a language of dignity would make us really rethink our whole approach to law and justice. One thing we know that there's often ways language supports violations of human dignity. In all forms of violence, one of the things language does is minimize the harm that we cause. Every other generation, we seem to recognize the harm that our systems of justice cause to people, and we start thinking about ways of doing justice reform. But for the most part, we support and recognize and accept that our justice system is going to cause harm to people, it's going to punish people, it's going to humiliate people, and that's what it's for. But there's an equally important way that the justice system can provide for dignity. By listening to people, by not just making them defined by what the law says they are, but recognizing them as human beings living in problematic conditions, which are often caused by situations of incredible social harm, where poverty is not just an individual problem, but it's a structural problem. We start bringing those understandings together. There's a language that will let us do that, by recognizing the person in their context as opposed to the person totally defined by law. Another thing that the law does to provide for humiliation and pain causing is it clouds it in some social good. We're protecting society. We're keeping the rabble at bay. We're defining all these evil people that are out there with our language. We're separating those people from the community and separating ourselves from the community. But there's an equally powerful language that recognizes that they're all part of the same community. We bring them together. They are us and we are them. If we start from that position, then humiliation or pain causing is very different. And I could go on and on, but there's a whole litany of the way language hides and denies the pain and humiliation that we cause and make it acceptable, versus a language that recognizes human dignity in terms of justice and law that can keep communities together rather than pulling them apart.
Right. Yeah, taking from where my colleague left, we as a group thought that law and justice has to be very essential element when we talk about dignity, because otherwise it would we may be able to touch upon different facets of it in terms of social space though, but it may to some extent remain abstract in nature. And since we all have been able to come to a collective notion that dignity has to perhaps be understood as a moral core. And since law does not define as to what is the minimum morality, but there has to be different notions which we fix. So, in that context, law identifies different definitions for different sorts of human behavior. And from there we try to see that how the morality has to be taken up, and one of the important facets is human dignity. And in that respect, we have tried to identify on the basis of experience of some of us who are law professors, some of us who have got into the law teaching on the basis of our experience as attorneys. For example, Professor Michael was with us, who has done 13 years of lawyering before that. So we thought that this entire discourse of law and justice vis-a-vis dignity has to be understood where, for example, creating alternatives to traditional court system is very important issue. What is happening presently is the regular courts, especially in the common law countries, where most of us come from, so there the largest space is dominated by the courts in terms of civil or the criminal courts, and they are mostly problem-solving courts. However, lesser emphasis is given in terms of trying to also see that they fix the accountability with regard to violations of dignity. However, definitely with regard to US having a very long-standing constitution and a powerful judiciary, that how the judiciary in the US has since so many years been able to define that these are the minimum civil liberties non-negotiable. Likewise, for example, in my country, in India, the Supreme Court has been able to define that these are non-negotiable sort of rights, and you cannot, tamper with them at any cost. So human dignity is one of the core values along with that. And we, as a group, we thought that humanizing judiciary is another very important aspect, because without that, you cannot, expect a judge who has been formally trained on the procedural side to understand and be sensitized enough to different aspects of society. Especially this would be, I guess, relevant for the countries like South Asia, or the countries which are still in the transition, where the judges need to be having a very careful sort of giving attention to such a level of diversity of haves and haves not. So they need to balance that sort of a thing and establish somewhere a sort of an equilibrium between the two. In that regard, before I just pass on it to my colleague, I'll just read out one paragraph with permission of my team here, that when we talk about law and justice and dignity, this very important and very fundamental decision which is passed by the Indian Supreme Court, which is Francis Karoli Mullin versus Union Territory of Delhi, in which the judiciaries tried to define that how dignity from the judicial point of view could be seen as one of the moral code that we as a group has been able to think about it. So I'll just quickly read it out to you. Yeah, so the Indian judiciary said that right to life includes right to live with human dignity and all that goes along with it, namely the bare necessities of life, such as adequate nutrition, clothing, shelter, facilities for reading, writing, expressing oneself in diverse forms, freely moving out, mixing, commingling with fellow human beings. Every act which offends against or impairs human dignity would constitute deprivation pro tanto of this right to live with dignity. Right? So that's how I think judiciary, even in the US, has been trying to say on the same lines that there cannot be any sort of a digression or dilution of human dignity. Yeah. Now we have our colleague Peter who would talk about trauma-informed approaches.
Yep.
I guess I need a microphone.
Yeah. I'll give you that. You can come and join.
I'm not going to be long. I think we've covered much of this because trauma-informed approaches actually speaks to a lot of what people have been talking about. Just the idea that the judiciary address the full complex aspects of people's lives who come before it, whether they come before it as somebody who's been harmed or somebody who's caused harm, that they be designed in such a way that they reduce powerlessness for everybody involved, that they address the social and environmental aspects of those lives and understand that that has an impact on how people behave, and just to build on empowerment for everyone involved. So,
And let me just tie one more thing in. That's it's a new trend really in justice, especially on the criminal side. And that is, rather than focusing just on incidents that are brought before the court by a very selective process by which police and prosecutors select those cases that get before the courts, we're talking about a more population-based approach, which is prevention. How do we attack those conditions that produce the problems that people have that bring them before the courts so that those problems don't exist? And we can then not have those problems to deal with, which provides justice for more and more people and builds in the communities. And that's a kind of trauma-based approach to prevention, which is built on dignity and not on social humiliation. And that's starting to happen, especially in the area of violence, as they start to understand the cyclical nature of trauma, violence production. Trauma produced by violence, violence expresses the trauma. And as they start to reduce that, they're also starting to reduce the levels of violence, which we normally consider as a criminal offense. So that sort of thing is starting to bring in much of what we talked about in terms of bringing in human dignity to the process. But it involves the whole community and not just the individuals who the system tends to deal with in a traditional system. It's a whole new perspective.
I'm just, it's okay.
You'll have to get it. I can't get it.
This is just building on what was said earlier of, we already have a model. We have problem-solving courts, not just in the US, but in Australia and in New Zealand. Courts that lower recidivism, courts in which we see the people who are before them have far better employment records afterwards. There are courts in New York, there are courts in Florida, courts all over the country. We can do this. The model is there to provide, to maximize dignity and to minimize shame and humiliation. There's very interestingly tremendous pushback from those forces that want to continue to shame and want to continue to humiliate. Forces in many of the major district attorneys' offices in the nation, I must say. But we have models that we can draw on. Unlike some of the problems, I was so forlorn after Michael Britton's great talk, you know, about climate change, like what can I do? But here we have something. So I believe it or not, I have some optimism.
Right. Thank you.